Welcome to the Big Rethink Interviews. I'm Bryan Alexander, the interviewer, and I'm with several other awesome people. So to begin with, let's hear from our students. Sandy Lee.
Hi, my name is Sandy, and I am an alum student participant in this summer's the Big Rethink course.
Welcome, welcome. And Angie?
Hi, I'm a second year LDT student, and I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'm really glad to hear it. And where are each of you? Angie, are you actually in Manhattan right now?
Yes, I'm in Upper Manhattan.
And Sandy, where are you today?
I am in Glover Park, the neighborhood above Georgetown in Washington, D.C.
Oh, very good. I'm coming to Manassas, Northeastern Virginia, close to D.C. And Associate Provost Noah Pickus. What is your full and appropriate title, and where are you coming to us from today?
I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina, and my full title, I don't know if it's appropriate because you might fall asleep in the middle of it. So I teach at Duke. I've been here 20 plus years. I'm a Associate Provost and Senior Advisor at Duke, and I'm Dean of Curriculum and Faculty Development at Duke Kunshan University in China. Fantastic,
fantastic. Well, I'm very, very glad you could make time for us today. I really, really appreciate it, and we're really looking forward to the conversation. So on that note, let's just dive right in. We have a stack of questions, and the questions are based on, well, almost all of these are questions that we've put to everybody. If I was a social scientist, I'd say we administered these. They start at a pretty big level, and then they get larger and larger, and then they zoom in to a few slices of higher ed. So we'll begin with one that is actually a pretty big picture question, which is, what are you seeing right now in higher education as a whole, as it responds to the huge developments of 2020, in particular, the COVID pandemic and the anti-racist mobilization under the header of Black Lives Matter?
I think I see on COVID, I see what I think everyone sees, which is there are three kinds of responses. There's the Cal State response, which got out early, committed to online, and has been pushing ahead with that. There, on the other end, there are institutions like Purdue and variously UNC and others that, for different reasons and pressures, are holding on to the to maximize in person as much as they can. And then you have the vast majority of institutions that I track, at least, which long ago understood they would need some kind of hybrid kind of face-to-face, online, resilient, flexible approach. But every day you see the division between those who have concluded that they can't do that and they need to move fully online, and those institutions that are trying to see it through. So you've got 3 or 4, depending on how you want to split it, kind of responses. On the Black Lives Matters movement, I think I see two things. One is I see an enormous opportunity that a lot of people and places are taking up in a way that I haven't seen before. If I can make an analogy, I taught ethics and public policy for many years. And a lot of the ethics course was essentially about, we can focus on cost-benefit analysis and the specific ways we can address issues, but there are larger institutional and structural issues that shape how we go about what we count as a cost and a benefit and how we would address that. And we didn't have much chance in the normal public policy education to look at those structures. So from a similar perspective, from ethics to racial inequality, I'm seeing a huge opportunity. Although I am also concerned that it's too early to say, but that we may also be seeing a lot of self-inflicted wounds. And by that, I mean that it's hard to tell what degree the various efforts universities have signaled that they will take, particularly in the educational sphere, the teaching, to address issues of systemic inequality, to what degree those are going to be open-ended analytical explorations of what do you mean by systemic? How do you define inequality? What are the competing perspectives on this? And to what degree, because they come as a response to the large social movement that we're seeing, they will be much more focused on answers that are approved as opposed to analyses that you would give. And to me, it's the same thing like teaching ethics. You want students to focus on ethical issues, but you teach a variety of different contending, difficult trade-offs. You don't teach a single approach. So I think the question is, will we take up this opportunity or will we squander it?
We actually, when we put these questions together, they felt a bit global, a bit intertwined. And we found that in the course of the interviews, people often will anticipate some of the later questions with their own answers. And you just did this perfectly. You just hit one, if not two questions to come up. Thank you. That's really, really well put. Well, let's stay on that landscape question, and let's aim for less of a qualitative and more of a quantitative angle. And let me ask, what kind of trends or metrics do you track, or do you recommend that we track as we try to monitor these changes and these responses, be they self-inflicted wounds or otherwise?
Well, I think, let me distinguish between what might be a list. My guess is your list is already better than mine. But a list of things to track, and then a more qualitative or maybe summative perspective on it. Okay. So and this applies not just to the current pandemic. I think these are things that you would track, as you do, Bryan, in higher education in general. And this ranges from demographics and internationalization, right? Internationalization is an easy one to pick right now. So many schools have gotten dependent upon students from abroad, particularly from China. And now for both health and political conflict and value differences, there's a real question about what that strategy looks like. I think there's a set of metrics and trends about the work and workforce, about automation, and about the role of alternative certifications and how that's going to grow. I think that questions about the balance between the STEM focus and more social scientific and humanistic approaches. So, you know, if you want a longer list, I could give it to you, or I could give you more pieces. But as I say, I suspect you all know that quite well. I'm mindful that in the institutions I currently work in, there are some issues that are relevant, but they're not as relevant and prominent as they are in most of higher education in the US. So, for instance, I co-direct this ASU Georgetown Academy for Higher Education Leadership, and there we have a lot of academic leaders from a wide range of schools. And the issues you see there on access and accessibility and on the growth of adjuncts, that doesn't play out the same all across the higher education landscape. but it's obviously crucial. So if I were to step back and try to say something about this beyond a list of things to track, I think the main thing that I see is twofold. One is that most institutions are responding to changes in the external environment. Doubts about higher education, rising costs, growth in technology, demographic change, but they're very much in a responsive mode. They are not in an internally driven innovation system. What are we trying to create here that takes account of these changes, but isn't simply responding to them? That's the first big item. So is your institution or our institutions, do they have an internal driver, or is it mostly a response to external factors? And the related element, which is more macro, is on the one hand, I think there's a possibility that we will see a growth in the quality of online education. And at the same, and that's a good thing. And at the same time, I think we may see a exacerbation of the inequality in which a very small number of people have a remarkable, immersive, residential, fully augmented experience. And the good news is that if more people are getting a quality online education, that's a good thing. But the gap is also going to open up even more between those who get the quality immersive experience.
Between those who can offer that kind of high quality experience and those who cannot.
Yes, those who are able to offer it, and able means both in terms of aspiration, but also in terms of just the financial model for being able to sustain it.
Well, I really appreciate the way that you broke up the question into list and summative, because those are two very, very different realms of tracking, and they're both very rich. If I just quickly ask one clarification, if I can say it, one clarification question about your list. Under workforce, do you mean, does that refer to the campus workforce, faculty and staff, or does it mean the broader picture of labor in the surrounding economy?
Well, I meant it the latter, but it applies to both, though in a different way. There's clearly a workforce issue on campuses, right? That the growth of adjuncts is, I don't have to tell you about that. You know more about that than I do. But the growth of adjuncts is a significant labor force issue in higher education. I was speaking, though, more about the broader notion of, in a world essentially of artificial intelligence, where if you read, whether it's Joseph Aoun or you read the Strata Robot Ready report, the clear point that that the future, that lots of businesses or lots of professions that we thought might be good, solid things to go into. Once it was radiology, then it was accounting, right? Pretty soon, all of those things are going to be done better by AI. And so the notion that the workforce, that we change the higher ed, people often think about the US higher ed system as not very innovative, not having changed much. And yet, if you look at the last 2 or 3 centuries, it's had enormous change. Coming out, the 19th century was a radical change in our educational system, largely in response to a changed workforce set of needs, right? Now we're seeing a similar kind of change. And the question is, what is going to be adequate preparation for a more AI kind of world? And that applies at the, if I can say it, the more narrow vocational sense, as in what education can I get to get me a job that won't be displaced, but also at the more broadest sense, which is how will I be the master of this future rather than simply a subservient to it. And here you get at the thing that is close to my heart, which is the connection between the liberal arts and sciences broadly understood and the technical skills that are needed, and the importance of joining both of those and not separating them out. And there are very few places that are doing a good job of that right now, partly because institutions are not set up to think about, so to speak, the AI and the EI and how they go together.
Thank you. And that's a fantastic unfolding on that one particular point. And I like seeing CP Snow play a role in this. Well, let's look ahead a little bit then. What we've been discussing is in many ways the current time, this annus mirabilis or annus horribilis of 2020. But looking ahead a bit, I wonder, where do you see the long-term changes happening to higher education as a whole? And you can speak to Duke and Duke Kunshan if you'd like as examples of that.
Well, let me start a little broader, and I'm happy to bring it closer to home if that will help.
Okay.
I don't have a clear crystal ball reading on this. I think of this as we're all groping a little unclearly. That's a word. We can't see, we're in a fog, and we're groping around trying to understand what's happening and how it will play out over 10 or 20 years. And what I've mostly been tracking is the 10 plus year out options and how they're starting to show up now. Mm-hmm. So you might see I mentioned the futuristic one, the Scott Galloway kind of notion of the MIT at Google model, and the extent to which if the high brand value institutions were to decide to expand not their physical campuses, but their online presences, the ways in which that would be bad for many specific higher ed institutions, but could be good for higher ed in a variety of ways. But then there's the dystopian version of that, right? There's the Audrey Waters kind of version that you combine a sort of fixation on technology with a venture capital masters of the universe approach and growing inequity. And we're just going to see the worst version of this future. Depending on who you're talking to and what vision they're giving you, it's easy to see pluses and minuses here. What I see mostly happening right now is much more, particularly for the kind of campuses that I work on and liberal arts colleges, the more augmented approach. And I don't mean augmented as in the virtual reality sense, though perhaps that as well. But the idea that institutions either will be forced or ideally will seek out ways in which they provide higher quality immersive experience. They have reduced time for tuition, reduced time to completion in tuition, Michael Roth's argument, or more forms of dispersed education, not always residential in one place, more public-private partnerships. So there are various futuristic scenarios, and then there are, I think, more augmentations of the existing campuses that we have. And so if that's 10 to 20 years out, if you back it up, I see the changes playing out in three places. One is in the academic calendar. It's become it's become plain to everybody who wants to see during this pandemic what many of you who have focused on this have long known, which is we have an academic calendar that was created for a variety of reasons, but we don't utilize a 12-month academic calendar in ways that might lead to shorter completion times, more functional learning and teaching for students. So there's been an opportunity to break up the calendar because people have had to. When we created Duke Kunshan University, we created 7-week immersive modules on the grounds that the 14-week semester gets pretty draggy around weeks 8 to 12. And we could be more mobile and immersive in that. So one is the calendar. The second I would focus on is the campus itself, is literally the location aspect. You know, for so long we've had this, I realize this doesn't apply to all institutions, but to the set that I work with mostly, you have the residential and then you go to Australia or you go to Spain and then you come back, right? And the notion that that you might have, partly for de-densification reasons, partly because real estate may become cheap, and partly just because you can have more flexibility in your system if you're not all on the campus at any one time. So that's a second change or area. And then the third and the biggest is what's going to happen with pedagogy. And I won't say too much about this because I think you want to get onto this question later on, but I would just emphasize that, as I said earlier about racial issues, we have the greatest opportunity I've seen in 30 years to actually focus on what we mean by quality education, teaching and learning. But I have a lot of doubts about whether we're going to sustain that.
I hope we can. I hope we can. Thank you. That's a very, very good vision, and I appreciate the bibliography of your vision, from Michael Roth to Audrey Waters to Scott Galloway. This is a very rich answer to a very ambitious question.
Well, you're always so generous. You should feel free, Bryan, to say it was rich and overlong. Could you make it briefer?
No, so far you're speaking with such precision. I mean, you mentioned teaching ethics. I can almost hear a courtroom lawyer in you. You know, giving the jury the great points. There's nothing I would have carved out of this, but I do need to defer to my students for this next question. And I think Angie, if you are still there and still in connection, Angie and Sandy, and also our missing third, Brianna, had questions about the Durham campus and how it responds to racial justice. Angie, do you want to try the first question about philanthropic and advancement efforts?
Sure. Thank you, Bryan. So I guess this is a two-part question, but our first component revolves around philanthropy. So we're just curious to know, how has Durham responded in terms of philanthropic and advancement efforts, and primarily aim to serve their most vulnerable student populations? And if there's anything, I'm sure you already have a philanthropic and advancement team that works on this, but if you know of any change to this or specific response to what's been going on.
So Angie, I don't, but that is simply a function of I don't know what is going on in that area. I know that the president of the university, I think about a month ago, I have to check, had sent out a pretty comprehensive list of a set of initiatives related to racial inequity. I would have, but it's not an area in terms of the advancement that I work on to know where they are fitting into that. They're certainly, very front and center at lots of institutions now are some immediate issues. about maintaining financial aid, about tuition, about helping. I will say that both at Duke and at Duke Kunshan University, the extent to which people talk about paying attention to the equity issues is much more prominent than I've seen before. Whether that amounts to enough, whether you would agree with it, what is being done philanthropically, I just don't know. But you certainly see it as a principle that shapes policy responses.
That's great. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Angie. We had a follow-up question along those lines from Sandy and Bree. Sandy, do you want to put this to our guest?
So I'm very interested in just international branch campuses and overseas branch campuses. So my question is, how will the response at the Durham campus on racial justice, inequity, and like biases, how would that translate and apply to the Kunshan campus in terms of faculty training, curricula, and or student activities? I know they're located in different countries, and I'm wondering like if those initiatives that will be taking place on the Durham campus, if that will also be anticipated at the Kunshan campus.
So it's a lovely question because it helps to get at the point of the campus in Kunshan. So Duke Kunshan University, Duke wanted to launch DKU, not because the goal was to take Duke as it is and put it down in China, right? That the leadership that wanted to launch DKU had several motivations. One of them was, if you're going to be global, you need to really be embedded in a place. You can't just visit. That it's different when you're living there and your faculty and students are part of it and you're navigating the many different issues that you have to handle there. So it was moving from an internationalization as a visiting relationship to a more embedded one. Another part was to have a research platform in Asia. But the fundamental reason was to use the creation of a new campus with its own faculty and its own majors and its own students. The students will get a Duke degree, but their curriculum is built on Duke's, but then mixed with many others. We used a kind of open source approach from NYU and Yale MUS, from Williams and Wesleyan, from Duke and elsewhere, so that it's important to understand that DKU is meant to be a site of innovation, of doing things differently than you would do them if you were just on the home campus, where there's a lot of great things about the Duke home campus, but it's also an established campus with a set of structures that are harder to change. Now, why do I tell you all that? I say that as background because the question of diversity in the context of a global institution has some overlap, but is different. And by global, I mean Duke, like many American institutions, is global in that we have faculty and students from all over the world. But it won't surprise you to say that it is still very much an American style institution. And if you ask any international student, they would tell you that. So the question we have at DKU is we have a whole set of range of diversities that is quite different. We have, I think, 46 or 40 students from 48 countries from around the world. Then we have the diversity around across China and amongst our Chinese students and the various levels of diversity that exist there. And so the question that we are taking on right now is recognizing that this is an important moment for addressing these issues of inequity and diversity. How do you do that in a way that doesn't simply import something that was developed at Duke or developed in the US and put it down in a very different kind of setting? Now, there will be things that Duke and DKU can learn from each other, but DKU has a its animating principle translates as rooted globalism. In other words, it's not primarily nationalistic. It's not Princeton in the nation's service, but neither is it seeking a kind of abstract global citizenship. Its animating principle is that we have, all of us are connected between the tension to be global and cosmopolitan, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have traditions and values and histories and identities that we are navigating at the same time, and that's a tension that will never go away. So the short way of saying this is we're seeking to develop our own approach to this, one that we hope we can learn some from our Duke cousins, while at the same time we hope Duke and others might learn something from what a new institution develops. But we're at the very beginnings of that.
Well, Sandy, I hope that's satisfying.
Yes, like, it completely makes sense. Like the demographics are just a little bit different from the Durham campus, so there needs to be a different type of strategy.
Yes. Rooted globalism becomes quite complex this way. Well, thank you, Noah, for that very visionary answer. Actually, we'd like to broaden our lens to the biggest aperture possible now, and we'd like to ask, looking ahead to where higher education is going, how do you see higher ed hitting some of these other major trends? I'm thinking of, for example, climate change or economic inequality. I mean, how do you see those crashing together with the way academia is responding to COVID-19 as well as to anti-racist activism?
I think my way into that question is to pick up on what I said at the very beginning, which is that universities and colleges have to do two things simultaneously, either one of which is very difficult right now, but the two together are especially difficult. So one is to recognize when something is different, right? In other words, we've always had concerns about the environment, right? You can go to lots of colleges and universities that have thought about, that you studied Thoreau, you thought about the environment, right? But we are moving into a stage where, of course, issues of sustainability and climate change are now existential questions, even more so. Economic inequality, there's long been inequality throughout human history in the US. By some measures, there's less. In other ways, there's more right now. But those are two examples where an institution has to step back, I think, and say, are we just sort of, adding things on, or are we taking this? And here I'm focusing particularly from the pedagogical and the teaching and learning and the research perspective. Certainly you can add other aspects to that on both those themes about the financing of the institution, its investments and so forth. But the main point I'm trying to make is the first challenge is to recognize when something or things really are different. And therefore you have to rethink your education. How well does it do to teach economics and history and philosophy separately if we are facing an existential question of how to deal with climate change, right? And I didn't even include in that the sciences. So that's the first. The second challenge, I think, then, is how to make sure that the response is not a faddish response, that the response is not one in which as I said earlier about racial inequality or about ethics, that the response is one that says, what do we know about these issues? Where do people disagree inside the university and outside? How do we generate the most robust analysis and effort to address these problems? And it goes to the heart of the university. If a university says, well, we're in the social justice mission, so we're going to teach everybody about inequality and about climate change, and everybody has to think the same set of things, then the good news is they focused on some really important things. The bad news is that they focused on it in ways that will actually lead to a less good education and less good attempts to solve those problems. And that to me is, we all know that universities are full of people with great ideas about change, but the institutions themselves are pretty traditional and hard to change, both for good and bad reasons. And trying to do both of these, recognize the radical things we need to address differently, change how we're doing research, teaching, and learning, but also in ways that keep things open. That's just those are the two key things we have to do. And as I say, either of them is difficult, but the two together is, I'm not sure I've seen it yet at a university.
It's very, very hard, especially at the kind of inter or transdisciplinary way.
It is. Well, I mean, sorry to go on at length here, but I think it is for a reason, which is the energy, the commitment, the values that lead you to say inequality or climate change are so crucial that we have to make a greater effort, and we have to overcome the structures and the silos and the ways we've always done things, right? That's an energy that's about gas. That's about pouring it on. That's about dislodging ways we've done things.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part, which is saying, well, wait a minute. Do we all now believe the same thing? Can we say contrary things? Can we have doubts? Can we bring in contrary perspectives? I don't quite want to say that's a break, but if you allow me to go with that analogy, we have to do two things at once. And that's just very difficult for any institution to do. And higher ed is no different, and may in fact be maybe harder for us to do that.
But it must be. I'm tempted to make some observations about recent Chinese history, but I'm gonna hold back because we have better questions to ask. Thank you for this. Let's narrow our lens a little bit and let's think in terms of higher education and 2020 by means of revelation. What do you see that the different events and developments and crises of this year have revealed to the world about higher education? And by that, I don't mean necessarily discovered something that no one had ever talked about before. These can be things that a few of us knew or some people did, but that are now open to the world at large, or that are now open to higher education at large. I mean, what did 2020 reveal about higher ed?
I think it revealed that, and you'll understand this, I grew up in Berkeley, so this is Californian speaking. It revealed that like the earth before an earthquake, like the ground before an earthquake, the tectonic plates have been shifting, but they just haven't broken through yet. And we are in a very precarious situation. And anybody who's looking at how every institution has tried to respond to this pandemic, here I'm speaking particularly in the US, sees how precarious things are. And it's one of those situations where it reveals, earlier in our conversation, we've been talking about different futures, different possibilities, both that you or I might judge as good or bad, right? But we've been opening up the possibilities. Now I want to say something a little more, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but maybe a little bit more of a downer. And that is, anybody who ever thought differently now sees clearly that most higher ed, and certainly the parts I work in, combine three different elements, right? One part is the brand value of the degree.
Right.
A second part is the social dimension of the experience, particularly for the students. And the third is the education itself, whether in its narrow skills training or its broad transformative humanistic flowering.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody now gets that those three things exist in this bundle that a lot of universities, consumers look at it and don't quite and can't disaggregate. But we're seeing the disaggregation here when people say, well, I want a lower tuition, right? Well, why? Well, online education is no good. Well, maybe, maybe not, right? That's a whole nother question. But partly because, well, it might be because the brand value of my degree will be lower if I'm seen to have had 2 years at X quality institution, but it was online, right? Or actually, the social experience of being with my peers and the networking and the coming of age experience is missing. And so even if you're not technically charging me for that, I was okay with that larger bundle. Or maybe I wasn't okay with it. I thought it cost a lot, but I get how it went together for that part of our higher ed landscape where those things are connected. And so I think what the current pandemic, the crisis, has made clear to everybody is suddenly everybody's an expert on what one part of a university should cost. And what a lot of people in universities will tell you is, despite all the criticism about rising costs, about which we could have another discussion, you know, what makes universities special places is often the ways in which these things go together. And it's an alchemy, it's an organic dimension. And when you lose that organic dimension, and each aspect is not fully developed, online is good in some ways, not so good in others, that we're seeing how precarious each aspect of that is. Our coming of age social experiences for the 18 to 22-year-old set, right? Again, just that part of the landscape, is going to college and drinking a lot. Really, is that what we wanted? Our educational aspect is this notion of the transmission of information rather than this high quality, agile, flexible, resilient learning. So it's peeling that away, that when these things all went together, it was harder to see.
So there's a combination of disaggregation and degradation that walks us away from that alchemy.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen other alternatives. You see Michael Crow makes this argument very well at ASU, which is that the notion that we should unbundle everything, right? The sort of Clay Christensen disruptive innovation approach, that Crow's whole argument is universities' creative elements work when you have the research and the teaching and the immersive and the residential and the application aspects all turning on each other, all working together. And we're seeing sort of the nightmare version of that right now, which is institutions where these things all exist, but they were not conceived of that way. People are saying, well, why do I pay for that part if you're not offering this part, right? And it goes back to this notion of having an internal driver for why we do what we do together, because otherwise it's a quite reasonable thing, and maybe quite reasonable in some cases, to disaggregate these things.
Makes me think of everyone dislikes cable companies, and one reason is that forced aggregation. I'm speaking of aggregation, I'm also conscious of time, and I don't want to aggrandize myself across your entire afternoon. We thank you for the answer to this. This is quite a vision, and I want to narrow our picture down to three smaller pieces now. And I think you've anticipated and touched on each of these so far in some very interesting ways. The first has to do with the LDT program itself. Instructional design is a key component of this program. Some of our students come to us as instructional designers, and some graduate to go on to become instructional designers. And I'm curious what you see as the role of the ID profession in 2020 in trying to help higher education address these huge issues, and what can instructional designers do?
So this is paradoxically a wonderful moment for instructional designers, because there has been a sea change in the last 6 months in American higher education. There were some places, you know, the Southern New Hampshires, the ASUs, that had built up more instructional designers and made that part of the plan, and people argued about the value, but there was an argument about it, and people could explain the value and people could disagree. But in so many institutions that I'm familiar with, you know, the teaching and learning centers, which is often where the instructional designers were sort of something you had to have. And some faculty found real partnerships there, real collaborations, but they were not drivers. They were not really seen as central to the operation. And to me, what's changed at so many institutions is people, it started with, oh, help us learn the technology, right? How do I do Zoom? But what I've seen is that the appreciation for teaching and learning centers and for learning innovation and for instructional design has gone up enormously amongst the faculty. And it's gone up because it's not about the technology. It's gone up because, well, maybe I should restate that. The first reason faculty, I think, have gotten far more positive views of instructional designers is the idea that those people, the instructional designers, pivoted and were there and solved problems and made it easy. And the team here at Duke Learning Innovation, and our team at Duke Kunshan University, it's just the faculty love them. They are so appreciative of how they help them to understand how to create a hybrid course, how to do a fully online course. We had so many people who had no online experience. So they got some street credibility, right? You were in a firefight and you wanted these people on your side.
Right.
But the second thing that has become clear, although I don't know how long this will last, the second thing that has become clear is that while there are some things to learn about technology and how it can help you, most instructional design is about thinking better and harder about your instructional design, right? It's actually thinking that teaching is not teaching, it's learning, right? It's how do students learn, not just how do you teach. And that so many of our institutions have very fine teaching. Some people are fabulous, some are not so good, most people are somewhere in the middle, but teaching is appreciated but not rewarded. And the last 6 months have seen nobody is talking other than faculty about research. People are talking primarily about how do you teach? How do you do it in a quality way, in a flexible way, in an equitable way? Everyone's having that conversation. And instructional designers are very much part of helping to think about that and how to think about remixing and reusing your different parts of what you teach and other people teach, so you can mash it up in creative ways. That's the most incredible moment that I hadn't expected. And I think the key thing is, as the pandemic, God willing, recedes, will we go back to normal? Will we go back to, yes, we have instructional designers. Yes, it's good to have a teaching and learning center. That would be the status quo, as opposed to, these are the ways in which my institution and your institution, or our institutions collaborating, can see innovations in teaching and learning as truly necessary and worthwhile. And that will run up against all the challenges that exist, particularly at research institutions where you have to meet multiple missions.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Thank you. This is that's that difference between instructional designer helping you with the technology, which some have called the Kinko's model, versus helping rethink teaching, as you say, which is really learning. That's a huge difference. And I hope that keeps going. We want to ask a different slice question now, which is about science and research. In 2020, we've seen this really interesting divergence of attitudes, at least in American culture, which is that we've seen a lot of embrace of or acceptance of public science in terms of the pandemic, so epidemiology and public health, but also to a degree social science. You think about the research into intersectionality and so on that informs anti-Black anti-racist activism. And yet we've also seen the opposite. We've seen people rejecting public health measures and so on, sometimes quite enthusiastically and sometimes in the halls of government. What is this telling us about how academic research crafts its messages? I mean, what does it tell us about how we can persuade people to heed the importance of such science?
So I don't know that I have any particularly distinctive comment to make on that. I'll give you a few thoughts. Although I might start by gently challenging the way you framed it.
Please.
Because I think if the question is how do we craft our message, then we've already got a transmission model. We, the experts, have the answers, and we just need to figure out different ways to get you people to agree with us, because we're right, right? Now, look, there's a long history in American life of distrust of elites and experts, right? There's a long history of that, and the current president has exacerbated it in ways none of us perhaps could have predicted. So, you know, when he says fake news all the time, it gets those of us in the academy very upset, because we believe there is real news and it's based on real facts and real expertise. But it's also clear, I think, that, I don't know about you, but it's not just that I can't trust my president, I can't trust the New York Times. I don't trust them. They are so value-laden in how they are talking about things and the assumptions they're making, that if I put a happy face on this, I'd say all of us are looking to get more and more data and information and perspectives than we used to, but I don't actually think that's happening. And so on the one hand, I don't want to deny, or I would start with the problem of the American distrust of expertise to begin with. And it's a whole set of problems. But it just makes it too easy on us. If you ask what the religion of most people in academia is, it's the religion of expertise. I know more than you do about this subject. And me and my friends who run this journal have all agreed that we have decided that these are the right things. Now, some of that is, of course, absolutely right. It's called open science. It's called putting these ideas out there and testing them and pushing and pulling. But you don't have to go very far. Just look at the controversies in psychology about the lack of replication.
Yeah.
So honestly, Bryan, why should people trust us? And again, I'm not saying that we don't need more expertise. I think that's crucial. But expertise married to social justice is just a fervent religion that will clash with people who have a different religion. I mean, this is just different worldviews at work. And the notion that one is right and one is completely wrong. The problem here isn't how do we change how we transmit our truths. The problem here is we have a deeply polarized society, and the ability to learn to analyze and explore different views. I'm not saying, oh, well, there's a flat earth and there's a round earth. Let's explore that, right? Obviously, there's a silly part to that. But universities, I think, have to be very careful that they don't get into the business of affirming the 10 truths that everybody must believe in, scientific or otherwise, because then they're not in the truth-seeking business or the education and the analysis and the disagreement business. And then they're just going to be seen as one more interest group. And indeed, they are increasingly seen that way.
Mm-hmm.
If it weren't for big-time sports at a lot of our colleges, even more of our citizens would have doubts about us.
Oh, definitely. Well, so, when I mentioned recent Chinese history, I was kind of quietly gesturing towards the Cultural Revolution there. You're absolutely, I mean, the replication crisis is enormous. I mean, psych is in many ways just the worst, but you're seeing this as well as in healthcare. But this is a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. We're going over and we have one last question to put to you, and I want to make sure we get to it. This is terrific. The last question is actually about technology. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to fix my Canvas class. The question has to do with the digital divide. And one of the things that seems to have been revealed in 2020 is that the digital divide is enormous and deep and has a huge, huge impact on us. I'm wondering, where do you see this headed? I mean, how did you experience this, perhaps in Kunshan and definitely in Durham? But how do you see the rest of us handling the digital divide in education?
So my experience, Duke Kunshan University, being in China, had to pivot to go online before we did so at Duke or here in the US, right? If you think about that, it was February and March, and we were already having to pivot, whereas things got worse here later on. And we had then faculty and students scattered all around the world. We had our students in China in quarantine. We had students in the city of Wuhan. I got pulled into co-teaching a global health course on how do we understand global pandemics like this, the science, the history, and the politics. Fantastic. And we had about 50 students for the DKU version, and then we did it again at Duke with about 40 students. Part of the interesting thing was when we did the Duke version, the DKU version, a lot of the issues were about wet markets and about Chinese quarantine laws and things like that. By the time we were teaching it at Duke, they were about what do you do with public health people who are, in that letter they wrote about how do you reconcile wanting to protest against social injustice with the concerns about spreading the virus. So the issues changed somewhat. But I guess what I was struck by was, and I don't know how well this answers your question, but from an anecdotal perspective, so we had students in very different circumstances. Many of them, were doing this at home from their dining room table with their parents there. We had students in New Zealand, and we had students in all parts of the US and across Asia and Europe. So we had wildly different time zones. We had a student in Ethiopia who not only was it a different time zone, but also the internet was not always available.
Yeah.
And, my big takeaway from this was, if you design for quality and for equity,
Mhm.
it's incredible how much you can manage the differences. And again, I don't want to be Pollyannish. If somebody doesn't have a home to live in or a computer to work with, then we have a serious issue. But I'm just giving you, because you asked about my experience, we figured out ways. So I had a TA who used Microsoft Teams to communicate with our student in Ethiopia, because she could use her cell phone fine. She just couldn't get on to the internet to download all the materials as easily. Or she had to get up at 4 a.m. to download things when the internet was on and the portal was open. It wasn't busy. My point being, everybody had to give a little bit. Nobody said it was ideal. And yet we had this incredible consideration with students all over the world in their home settings to understand, why are countries responding to the pandemic differently? Why is Sweden different from China, different from the US? How can we do this better? And so my answer was, the technology, you had to use different forms of technology. Some of them had to be asynchronous. Some of them had to be synchronous. Some of them had to be old-fashioned. Some of them had to be Microsoft Teams. But you could make it work if you were committed to it. It was all about good teaching. It was all about flexibility, and willing to put the effort in to that. Now, again, that can't solve the whole digital divide. But to me, it was an opening up. I'm used to teaching 18-person seminars around a round table. Suddenly I have 50 students around the world, and they were alive. They were alive to everything. So I have a more positive view of that.
That's a fantastic view. I think we should end on that note, because that is such a beautiful vision, and also a really, really great answer. I love this focus on, if we focus first on quality and equity, then that clarifies things. Noah, this has been fantastic. Angie, Sandy, would you like to add anything at the end?
I just want to thank you, Noah, for your time and your thoughts. I really enjoyed listening to your perspective, and I really appreciated your candor too.
Thank you, Angie. Much appreciated.
Yeah, I'll also say that I really appreciate joining this conversation, and especially since I was also interested to learning more about the Kunshan campus. So I think this whole interview has been really beneficial for me to just learn more about higher education in the US and also in other places. Thank you for coming.